All right, we're going to start looking at the big picture on the power of economic growth. Humans have been around for hundreds of thousands of years, but only in the most recent couple centuries has there been any real change in living standards. Economic growth in the totality of human history is weird, really unusual, but amazingly powerful. I like this thread from economist Dina Pomerantz, who shared some of the good news of the last decade of growth. The global fraction of people in extreme poverty, which the World Bank defines as less than $1.90 a day, was cut in half, 22% to a little over 10%. Fraction of children dying before age 5 dropped by a third, from 5.9% to 3.6%. Life expectancy rose over the entire world from 69.5 to 72.6. Population growth slowed and is projected to level off. Primary school completion rose for both boys and girls. Of course, climate change is still a huge problem, and there are a lot of other things that need to be changed. Another economist, Max Rosen, summarized, "The world is much better. The world is awful. The world can be much better." We should take hope from all the changes we see as we figure out the changes that still need to be made. All these growth facts are really encouraging, but obviously they're not enough. Now, for things like fraction of people in extreme poverty or fraction of children dying before age 5, we want both of those to get as low as possible, and we're not there yet. But there's been an incredible rate of progress. Here, for example, we have a graph of GDP per capita in 1950 and in 2016. And this is in real dollars, adjusted for inflation and purchasing power. We can see most countries in the world, with a few exceptions, are above the diagonal. They got a lot richer. This is a log scale, so that's a big difference. There are still some countries that are doing worse. If you squint and read the labels, you can probably understand the reasons for those. But global average income grew by a factor of 4.4, while world population increased by a factor of 3, so there are more people who are richer on average. Today, the average person in the whole planet is as rich as the average person in the very richest country back in 1950. That's a long time ago, before I was born, but there are plenty of people alive today who remember time in 1950. Today, by any historical standard, the average person on the planet is really rich. Now, we don't have as good data for further back in history, but as far as people can tell, by 1950, even then we were richer than any humans had ever been. We didn't evolve to be this wealthy. So at some level, it's not really a surprise that a lot of people have difficulties understanding just how good it is. Now, maybe you're saying money isn't everything, and you're right, it's not. So here's data on Human Development Index, HDI. That includes GDP, life expectancy, access to education. It's broader than just looking at GDP. This data go back 1870, and for almost 150 years, the US was best off by HDI index. Till recently, we lost the lead to countries like South Korea or Taiwan, which have higher life expectancy and better access to education. You see some others, such as the UK, which once long ago was in the lead, but has slipped a lot. Now, obviously, it's not all the countries in the world on the graph. This is just a selection. I've highlighted China, Brazil, Mexico, and Dominican Republic. You can see they've made substantial improvements as well. You can trace across horizontally from where China is now to see they are now approximately where the US was in 1950-ish. Typical person in China is a lot poorer than the typical person in the US right now. But on the other hand, if you compare to the US historically, there's enormous progress. Then we see countries like Botswana and India growing significantly and very quickly. So again, there's a lot of scope for optimism here. Now, I presented this Human Development Index, the HDI, and you might want to ask, well, how does that compare with just straight GDP? Money isn't everything, but it is really important. And here this plots GDP on the horizontal axis and the Human Development Index, HDI, on the vertical. We can see there's a strong positive relationship. Most countries are high up on both or lower on both. If we look at the exceptions, countries that are below that main trend, we see places like Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Equatorial Guinea, Qatar. So you can kind of assess, like, what do all those places have in common? Oil. They're rich in money, but not rich in terms of human development, which in some ways is not surprising, but also reasonable to ask what they're doing with all that money. Then you look at countries on the other side, above the main sequence, places like Cuba, Costa Rica, Chile, where the Human Development Index is above where the money would have led you to expect it. When we're looking at GDP growth, we often use the Solow growth decomposition, named after the economist Bob Solow. For a country, GDP can grow if any of a few principal factors grow. A country can increase GDP by having more people working in markets, if they have more better equipment and machinery, better technology, or if they discover natural resources. Now, each of these factors can be complicated in various ways. We say growth in the labor force, but we mean that as effective labor force. So even a country with the same number of people, but if they all get better educated, then that counts as growing the effective labor force because those better educated people can be more productive. Growth in effective labor force can be bringing in people from rural areas. It can be raising women's labor force participation. There are more options beyond just more people. So too with growth in machines and physical capital. Machines made back in 1950 meant massive things made out of iron, but nowadays a lot of the capital is software. You don't have to worry about dropping it on your foot. But it's still an important part of GDP growth. Then we look at growth in technology, new inventions, better organizations as well. If a business is managed better so they can produce more output, then it's kind of like a new invention. Then there's discovering new natural resources, oil, mines. And then I put a bullet there for other factors because, there are other things going on. Maybe the Netherlands increased the amount of land they have because they built dikes and, drove out the ocean. Natural resources, including clean air and water, are really important too. But it's helpful to concentrate on just a few categories. This helps us distinguish between GDP versus growth in GDP per person. Per capita is the formal term. Growing population is going to raise GDP overall, but that may not raise GDP per person. We want to be clear about the distinction. Comparing like the US and China, the US has a larger GDP, but fewer people. China has more people. Total GDP is catching up. But certainly GDP per capita is higher in the US. A lot of that greater GDP per capita is from having more capital, more machinery, more technology, organization. Bob Solow originally predicted there would be a tendency for convergence, especially in cases where technology can spill over. There's debate about how much that's going on, but certainly looking around the globe, those figures I presented earlier demonstrate how widespread economic growth is becoming. A lot of that is convergence. For example, a multinational company can build a factory anywhere in the world, and that'll be about as productive, regardless of who's working there. So economic growth is definitely weird in the sense of being highly unusual over all of human existence and history. At the beginning of the Common Era, the average income per person for the world was about $500 per year, and that's in today's money. More than 1,800 years, it had grown maybe $750 per person, which, is a big deal, but it's still extremely poor. But then, boom, the Industrial Revolution changed the trajectory of human society. Not everywhere, not all at once. It started only at one remote edge, not quickly enough. In a recent book, Brad DeLong estimates that real improvements to standard of living only began after maybe 1870 or so, as economic growth really took off. Economic growth comes with specialization. So, for instance, in poor countries, agriculture might contribute 25% of GDP, whereas in wealthier countries, it's more like 5% or less. My grandparents grew up on a farm, and that's true for a lot of people around the world, but nowadays, you may not even know a farmer. So as economist Partha Dasgupta points out, this means ecology is of direct concern to the world's poor in a way that it just isn't for the world's rich. That's why we'll talk about sustainability throughout this course. Specialization and trade are essential to people becoming richer. When people specialize in doing something, they get better at doing that thing. Then they need to swap their production with the stuff that other people have made. One person, specializes in herding goats. Somebody else makes pots. They want to get together and trade. So they need a market where they can buy and sell those goods. Usually those markets are in cities, where a lot of specialists gather because they need larger markets. Markets get broader and broader. Nowadays we call that globalization. But still there's a gap between rich countries and poor countries. Why? Well, part of the answer is that there is no simple answer. It's really complicated. It's not just one thing that can be easily fixed. Among the reasons for the gap include things like better equipment. Farmers use tractors, not plows pulled by animals, although even plowing by animals was a technological improvement, or pulled by humans. But then there's better education, even just literacy, although that gap is certainly exacerbated by gender inequality. Patriarchy makes the world poorer. Health is important, but health is related to wealth in two directions, right? Healthy people are able to work more effectively and therefore wealthier. But wealthier people are able to get better health care, so they're healthier. It's kind of a cycle, virtuous cycle. Nutrition is similar. As I noted earlier, population growth can raise GDP, not always GDP per person, so sometimes population growth can widen the gap or sometimes make it narrower. Economists worry about the fertility transition, where wealthier, better educated women can make choices about fertility and usually choose fewer children. But on the other hand, more people means more minds, so somebody can come up with a great new idea or invention that makes everybody wealthier. There are virtuous cycles and vicious cycles in there. The gap in wealth is often called the divide between the global north and the global south. There's a lot of discussion about why that divide is so big. Some of it's just random luck. The Industrial Revolution happened in obscure northwest corner of Europe. Could have happened somewhere else. Some of it's due to accidents of geography, later historical events like colonialism and slavery. But it's not due to differences in the quality of the people. Economic growth does not come just to those who deserve it. Economic growth is weird in the overall course of human existence. Humans have been on this planet for something like 250,000 years, but it's only in the last maybe 150, that's like 1/20th of 1%, that there's been economic growth very much. So it's not a surprise we don't understand enough about it. There's still a lot to learn. Looking forward to it in this course.